The rise and fall of superpowers in history. What if I told you that the story of today's superpowers actually began thousands of years ago, long before America was even a name on the map? Throughout history, the world has always been ruled by giant empires, so powerful that their names still echo in our books, our beliefs, and even our daily lives. The Quran itself mentions the mighty Roman Empire, a force so dominant that its rise and fall shaped the fate of entire continents. But the Romans weren't alone. Names like Zulkarnain, Pharaoh, and Nimrod are scattered across ancient texts, each representing a different era's ultimate authority. These weren't just rulers, they were the trendsetters, the lawmakers, the ones who decided what the world would look like for generations. But here's the twist. Every superpower, no matter how invincible it seemed, eventually faced a downfall. Sometimes it was a single mistake, a moment of arrogance, or a hidden weakness that brought them crashing down. The Romans, for all their glory, couldn't hold their empire together forever. Their cities crumbled, their armies scattered, and their influence faded into history. The same fate met the pharaohs of Egypt, whose monuments still stand as silent witnesses to their lost power. Even Zulkarnain, a figure shrouded in legend, couldn't escape the cycle of rise and fall. So why does this pattern repeat itself? Why do the world's strongest empires always seem to collapse just when they appear unstoppable? Some say it's the weight of their own ambition. Others believe it's the result of injustice, corruption, or simply the passage of time. But one thing is certain, understanding the superpowers of the past isn't just about memorizing names and dates. It's about recognizing the warning signs, the hidden cracks that can shatter even the mightiest of kingdoms. And if you think this is just ancient history, think again. The lessons from these fallen empires are more relevant today than ever before, because in every era, there's always a new contender for the throne, a nation, or a leader who believes they can rewrite the rules and outlast everyone else. But history has a way of repeating itself, often in the most unexpected ways. But what happens when a superpower ignores these lessons? What if the seeds of their own destruction are planted at the very height of their success? The answer lies in one of the most dramatic chapters of history, a story of betrayal, tragedy, and a single event that changed the fate of millions. And that's where our journey takes a dark and unforgettable turn. The Umayyad dynasty and the tragedy of Karbala. After the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, the Muslim world was united under the leadership of 4 legendary caliphs. In just a few decades, this small community transformed into a force that rivaled the greatest empires of its time. But unity is fragile, and history rarely moves in a straight line. Soon, the era of the rightly guided caliphs ended, and a new dynasty rose to power, the Umayyads. They were ambitious, determined, and ruthless in their quest to expand the Islamic Empire. Under their rule, the empire stretched further than ever before, and its economy flourished. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The Umayyads' hunger for control came at a heavy price. Their rule was marked by a growing sense of injustice, especially among those who felt excluded from power. But nothing would shake the Muslim world more than the tragedy that unfolded in the desert of Karbala. In a single, heart-wrenching event, the army of Yazid, the Umayyad Caliph, confronted the family of the Prophet himself. The result was a massacre so brutal that its pain still lingers in the hearts of millions. The family of the Prophet, his beloved grandchildren and companions, were mercilessly killed, their sacrifice echoing through centuries. Karbala was more than just a battle, it was a turning point. For the next 70 years, the Umayyads held on to power, but the memory of Karbala refused to fade. Instead, it grew stronger, transforming from grief into a burning anger that simmered beneath the surface of society. The injustice of Karbala became a rallying cry for those who felt oppressed, a symbol of resistance against tyranny. And as the Islamic Empire continued to expand, so did the resentment among non-Arab Muslims, who found themselves treated as outsiders in their own land. The Umayyads favored their own, giving little respect or opportunity to others, a mistake that would come back to haunt them. Imagine living in a world where your identity determined your worth, where your voice was silenced simply because of your background. That was the reality for many under Umayyad rule. The pain of Karbala, combined with the daily humiliation faced by non-Arabs, created a storm of discontent that could not be contained forever. People began to whisper, to remember, and to plot. The seeds of rebellion were sown, watered by the blood of martyrs and the tears of the oppressed. But anger alone doesn't topple empires. It takes a spark, an event, or a leader bold enough to challenge the status quo. And as the years passed, That spark was about to ignite a revolution that would shake the very foundations of the Islamic world. The story of the Umayyads was far from over. In fact, their greatest challenge was just about to begin. The Abbasid revolution and the Umayyad escape to Spain. As the years rolled on, the anger and resentment against the Umayyads only grew stronger. The memory of Karbala was kept alive by storytellers and mourners, whispered in every corner of the empire. But it wasn't just the pain of one tragedy fueling this unrest. The Umayyads' policies had alienated entire communities, especially non-Arab Muslims who felt like second-class citizens in a land that was supposed to unite all believers. The stage was set for a dramatic upheaval, and the Abbasid family was ready to seize the moment. The Abbasids were master strategists. They traveled from city to city, reminding people of the injustices suffered under Umayyad rule, especially the horrors of Karbala. Their message was simple but powerful. It was time for change. As anger turned into action, the Abbasids gathered support from all corners of the empire. When the time was right, they launched a rebellion that swept through the Islamic world like wildfire. The Umayyads, once untouchable, suddenly found themselves hunted and outnumbered. The Abbasid takeover was ruthless. The new rulers issued a chilling order. Every member of the Umayyad family was to be found and executed, no matter their rank or innocence. The Abbasid soldiers scoured the empire, leaving no stone unturned. One by one, the Umayyads were captured and killed, their dynasty seemingly wiped from the face of the earth. Only one grave was left untouched, that of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, a caliph remembered for his justice and piety. The rest were not so fortunate. In a shocking display of vengeance, the Abbasids even exhumed the bodies of Umayyad rulers from their graves, desecrating them as a warning to anyone who might challenge their authority. But history has a way of surprising us. In the chaos, a handful of Umayyad survivors managed to escape the Abbasid purge. With nowhere left to turn, they fled west, crossing deserts and seas in a desperate bid for survival. Their journey took them through Egypt, across North Africa, and finally to the distant shores of Morocco. But even there, safety was an illusion. The Abbasids pursued them relentlessly, determined to erase every trace of their rivals. Cornered and out of options, the last of the Umayyads made a daring decision. They would cross the treacherous waters to the Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain. It was a land already touched by Islam, but it was far from the center of power. Against all odds, the Umayyads found refuge among the Muslims of Spain, who welcomed them as fellow exiles. But these survivors were not content to simply hide. Instead, they set out to build something new, a fresh start, far from the reach of their enemies. In Spain, the Umayyads established a new dynasty, one that would soon rival the greatest empires of its time. Their capital, Córdoba, became a beacon of culture, science, and prosperity. For the first time, the Muslim world was split into two powerful empires, the Abbasids in the east and the Umayyads in the west. This division would shape the course of history for centuries to come. But the story of the Umayyads in Spain was more than just survival. It was a tale of resilience, reinvention, and the unbreakable will to rise again after total defeat. Yet, as history has shown time and again, every new beginning carries the seeds of future challenges. The Umayyads had escaped annihilation, but their journey was far from over. In their new home, they would face fresh enemies, unexpected alliances, and a struggle for survival that would test them like never before. The golden age and fall of Muslim Spain, the heart of Spain. The Umayyads did what few could have imagined. They transformed exile into opportunity. Far from the deserts of Arabia and the reach of the Abbasids, they built a new empire that would dazzle the world for centuries. Córdoba, their capital, became a city of light in a dark age, where scholars, poets, and scientists gathered from every corner of the known world. Streets were lit with lamps, libraries overflowed with books, and the sounds of music and debate filled the air. For nearly 800 years, Muslim Spain, known as Al-Andalus, stood as a symbol of tolerance, innovation, and prosperity. But even the brightest stars eventually fade. As the centuries passed, the unity that had made Al-Andalus so powerful began to crack. Rivalries between Muslim rulers, internal betrayals, and the slow rise of Christian kingdoms on the northern borders all chipped away at the empire's strength. Yet, for a long time, the Muslims of Spain held their ground, their cities thriving even as enemies gathered at their gates. Then, in a twist that would change the fate of millions, two small Christian kingdoms, Castile and Aragon decided to end their centuries-old rivalry. Their secret weapon wasn't an army or a new invention, but a royal marriage. King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile joined forces, uniting their realms and their ambitions. Suddenly, the divided Christian kingdoms became a single, unstoppable force, determined to reclaim Spain from Muslim rule. The campaign that followed was brutal. United under one banner, the Christian armies swept through Muslim territories, city by city, leaving devastation in their wake. The fall of Granada in 1492 marked the end of Muslim rule in Spain, but the suffering was far from over. Muslims and Jews, who had lived in Spain for generations, were given a cruel choice: convert, flee, or face death. The stories of families torn apart, of ancient communities erased overnight, still haunt the memories of those years. But the world was not as isolated as it is today. News of the atrocities in Spain reached the ears of the Ottoman sultans, the superpower of that era. In a rare act of compassion and strategy, the Ottoman navy sailed to Spain's shores, rescuing thousands of Muslims and Jews and offering them refuge in their own lands. The Ottomans welcomed these exiles, granting them citizenship and a new beginning. For many, it was a lifeline in a world that had turned hostile overnight. Yet, the fall of Muslim Spain was more than just a regional tragedy. It set off a chain reaction that would reshape the entire world. The Christian victory in Spain gave its rulers newfound confidence and resources. With their enemies defeated at home, Ferdinand and Isabella turned their gaze outward, hungry for new lands and new riches. The same year that Granada fell, a little-known explorer named Christopher Columbus arrived at their court with a wild proposal of voyage westward, into the unknown. What followed would not only change the fate of Spain, but would send shockwaves across continents, forever altering the balance of power. The end of Al-Andalus was not just the closing of one chapter, but the explosive beginning of another. And as the dust settled over the ruins of Muslim Spain, a new world was about to be discovered, one that would soon become the center of global ambition, conflict, and unimaginable change. The discovery of America and the end of Muslim dominance, the year 1492, is remembered for the fall of Granada. But what most people don't realize is that this same year would ignite a chain of events that would shift the world's center of power forever. As Muslim Spain crumbled, its conquerors, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, were already looking for their next big move. Europe was hungry for wealth, and the old trade routes to Asia, once bustling with spices and silk, had been choked off by the powerful Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, now the new superpower, controlled the crossroads between East and West, making it nearly impossible for European merchants to reach India and China without paying a heavy price. Desperation breeds innovation. Enter Christopher Columbus, a bold and persistent navigator with a radical idea. What if there was a shortcut to India by sailing west, across the uncharted Atlantic? At first, his proposal sounded like madness, but with Spain's recent victory and a thirst for new riches, Ferdinand and Isabella decided to take a gamble. They funded Columbus's voyage, hoping he would outsmart the Ottomans and open a new path to the treasures of the East. Columbus set sail with 3 ships, braving unknown waters and the threat of disaster. After weeks of uncertainty, his crew finally sighted land. But this wasn't India, it was a world no European had ever seen before. Columbus, convinced he had reached Asia, called the local people Indians, a mistake that would echo through history. In reality, he had stumbled upon the Americas, a vast continent teeming with life, resources, and civilizations that had developed in complete isolation from the Old World. Word of Columbus's discovery spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Spain found itself at the forefront of a new age of exploration and conquest. Spanish ships poured across the Atlantic, followed closely by the French, British, and Portuguese. The Americas became a battleground for Europe's greatest powers, each racing to carve out their own empires on this new frontier. The Old World Order, dominated for centuries by Muslim superpowers, began to unravel. The Ottomans, once the gatekeepers of global trade, watched as the center of wealth and influence shifted westward, beyond their reach. But the discovery of America was not just a story of adventure and opportunity. It was also the beginning of unimaginable suffering for the land's original inhabitants. European conquerors brought war, disease, and exploitation, wiping out entire civilizations in their quest for gold and glory. The riches of the New World flowed back to Europe, fueling the rise of new empires and changing the balance of power forever. For the first time in centuries, the Muslim world found itself sidelined, its influence waning as Europe surged ahead. The discovery of America marked the end of an era turning point that would set the stage for the rise of a new superpower. But as the world's focus shifted across the Atlantic, a darker chapter was about to begin. One built on the backs of millions who would be forced to cross the ocean in chains. Slavery, rebellion, and the birth of the United States as European flags began to flutter over the vast lands of the Americas. A new and brutal system took root, one that would shape the destiny of the continent for centuries. The riches of the New World were undeniable, but exploiting them required a workforce willing to endure unimaginable hardship. The answer, for the European colonizers, was as cruel as it was profitable. The transatlantic slave trade, ships packed with human cargo, began to cross the ocean, carrying millions of Africans torn from their homes and families, chained in the darkness below deck. These men, women, and children faced a journey so horrific that many never survived to see the other side. Those who did were sold like property, forced to labor in fields and plantations from sunrise to sunset. Their sweat and suffering built the foundations of the American economy, fueling the production of cotton, tobacco, and sugar that made Europe rich. But the story of America was never just about oppression. It was also a story of rebellion, of people who refused to accept their fate. As the British colonies in America grew wealthier, a new identity began to emerge, one that was fiercely independent and increasingly resentful of British control. The British Crown demanded heavy taxes and strict obedience, insisting that the profits of the New World flow back to London. But the colonists, many of whom had never even set foot in England, saw themselves as something different. Americans. Tensions reached a breaking point. The British imposed new laws, taxed everything from tea to paper, and sent soldiers to enforce their will. In response, the colonists organized, protested, and eventually took up arms. The American Revolution was born not just a war for independence, but a battle over who would control the future of this new land. Under the leadership of figures like George Washington, the colonists fought against overwhelming odds, driven by a vision of freedom and self-rule. Yet, the reality was far more complicated than the slogans of liberty suggested. While the revolutionaries spoke of rights and justice, the institution of slavery remained deeply entrenched. The very men who wrote about equality often owned slaves themselves, and the new nation's wealth continued to depend on the forced labor of others. For millions, the promise of America was a distant dream, overshadowed by chains and cruelty. Still, the revolution changed everything. The United States of America emerged as a new player on the world stage, a nation built on ideals that would inspire generations even as it struggled to live up to them. The British, though defeated in America, turned their attention to other parts of their empire, especially India, where new battles for power and independence were already brewing. But the contradictions at the heart of America could not be ignored forever. The fight for freedom had only just begun, and the struggle over who truly belonged in this new nation would soon erupt into conflict once again. As the young United States grew in power and ambition, the seeds of its next great crisis were already being sown, setting the stage for a war that would tear the country apart and force it to confront the darkest chapters of its own history. Civil War, inventions, and America's ascent. The United States, born from revolution and rebellion, quickly became a land of contradictions. On one hand, it promised freedom and opportunity. On the other, it was built on the backs of enslaved people whose suffering was ignored by those in power. As the nation expanded westward, these contradictions grew impossible to hide. The North, with its bustling cities and growing industries, began to clash with the South, where vast plantations depended on the labor of enslaved Africans. The question of slavery, whether it would continue or be abolished, became the fault line that threatened to split the country in two. It was Abraham Lincoln, a man from humble beginnings, who would step into this storm. Elected president at a time when the nation was on the brink, Lincoln made a decision that would change the course of history. He signed a bill declaring that all enslaved people in America were to be set free. This bold move outraged those who profited from slavery, especially in the South, and soon the country was plunged into a brutal civil war. Brother fought against brother, and entire cities were reduced to ashes. The cost was staggering: millions dead, families shattered, and a nation scarred by violence. But from this chaos, something remarkable happened. To win the war, America poured its resources into innovation. Factories that once made farm tools now produced weapons. Railroads stretched across the continent, and inventors raced to create new technologies. The telegraph, the sewing machine, and even the world's first airplane would all emerge from this era of relentless progress. America's industrial might grew at a pace the world had never seen, and with it came a new sense of confidence that yet, even after the war ended and slavery was officially abolished, the wounds of the past did not heal overnight. The struggle for true equality would continue for generations, as Black Americans faced new forms of discrimination and violence. Still, the end of slavery marked a turning point. The United States was no longer just a collection of states, it was a unified nation, ready to take on the world. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, America's economy exploded. Factories churned out goods for a growing population. Cities soared with skyscrapers, and millions of immigrants arrived in search of a better life. The country's wealth and influence spread far beyond its borders, and for the first time, the world began to see America as a rising power. But there was still one thing missing: global dominance. Europe's old empires, Britain, France, Germany, still held the title of superpowers. America was powerful, but not yet supreme. It would take a global catastrophe to tip the balance. As the world hurtled toward the chaos of the 20th century, the stage was set for a conflict so massive that it would redraw the map of power forever. The old world was about to tear itself apart, and America was waiting in the wings, ready to seize its moment. World wars, and the making of a superpower as the 20th century dawned. The world was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Old empires in Europe, Britain, France, Germany, were locked in a tense rivalry, each desperate to outdo the other in wealth, territory, and military might. The United States, meanwhile, watched from across the Atlantic, growing stronger but still seen as a newcomer on the global stage. Few could have predicted that a single event in a distant corner of Europe would unleash a storm that would change everything. World War I erupted with a ferocity no one had ever seen. Trench warfare, poison gas, and machine guns turned battlefields into graveyards. While Europe led, America stayed on the sidelines, supplying weapons and resources but avoiding direct involvement. It wasn't until the war's final years that the U.S. entered the conflict, tipping the balance and helping to bring the fighting to an end. When the dust settled, Europe was shattered, its cities in ruins, its economies crippled. In contrast, America emerged stronger than ever, its industries booming, and its currency, the dollar, becoming the new symbol of stability. But peace was short-lived. The Great Depression struck, sending shockwaves through the American economy and leaving millions jobless. For a moment, it seemed as if the dream of American dominance might collapse before it truly began. Yet, even in crisis, the seeds of resilience were sown. The country rebuilt, innovated, and prepared for whatever came next. Then came World War II, a conflict even more devastating than the first. Once again, Europe was engulfed in chaos, with new horrors unleashed by leaders like Adolf Hitler. The Nazis' rise, the Holocaust, and the relentless march of armies across continents threatened to plunge the world into darkness. At first, America hesitated, watching as the old powers fought for survival. But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. could no longer remain a bystander. America mobilized on a scale never seen before, sending millions of soldiers overseas and transforming its factories into engines of war. The turning point came with a weapon that would change history forever. Guided by the warnings of scientists like Albert Einstein, America raced to develop the atomic bomb. In a matter of seconds, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were reduced to ashes, forcing Japan to surrender and bringing the war to a dramatic close. The world was left and awed in awe of America's newfound power. With Europe devastated and the Soviet Union weakened by years of brutal fighting, the United States stood alone at the top. Its economy was unmatched, its military unrivaled, and its influence stretched to every corner of the globe. The world had a new superpower, one that would shape the destiny of nations for generations to come. But as America celebrated its victory, a new challenge was already emerging. The Soviet Union, determined not to be overshadowed, began a race for dominance that would plunge the world into a new kind of conflict. One fought not just with weapons, but with ideology, technology, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. The age of the Cold War was about to begin, and the battle for global supremacy was far from over. The Cold War and the final showdown victory in World War II left America standing taller than ever. But the world was far from peaceful. Across the globe, a new rival was rising: the Soviet Union. armed with its own atomic bomb and a vision for a different world order. The Soviets weren't just another competitor. They were a direct challenge to everything America stood for. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one that wouldn't be fought on battlefields alone, but in every corner of the globe, in laboratories, in space, and in the hearts and minds of billions. This was the Cold War, a 40-year standoff that would shape the destiny of the modern world. The race began with weapons, each side amassing enough nuclear firepower to destroy the planet many times over. But soon, the competition spilled into every aspect of life. The Soviets shocked the world by sending the first human into space, forcing America to respond with a surge of funding and innovation that would eventually put Neil Armstrong on the moon. The world watched in awe as the two superpowers battled for supremacy, not just with bombs and rockets, but with ideas, culture, and influence. Everywhere you looked, the world was divided. Nations were forced to pick sides: North Korea with the Soviets, South Korea with the Americans. Pakistan leaned toward America, while China and the Soviet Union formed their own uneasy alliance. India, in a move that would prove wise, mostly stayed neutral, avoiding the traps that left so many countries caught in the crossfire of superpower rivalry. Proxy wars erupted in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and beyond, as each side tried to tip the balance without triggering all-out nuclear war. But beneath the surface, the cracks in the Soviet system were growing. America's economy, fueled by innovation and global trade, continued to surge ahead, while the Soviet Union struggled under the weight of its own rigid system. The arms race drained resources, and the promise of communism began to fade as shortages, censorship, and unrest spread behind the Iron Curtain. The world watched as the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of division, finally crumbled in 1989. Just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, ending the Cold War and leaving America as the world's only superpower. It was a victory that seemed absolute. At the start of the 20th century, the world had been crowded with empires: British, French, German, Ottoman, Russian. By the century's end, only one remained at the top: the United States of America. Its economy, military, and culture dominated the globe, and its influence reached into every home, every government, every dream of the future. But history never stands still. As America celebrated its triumph, new challenges were already brewing. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the spread of technology have all begun to reshape the global landscape once again. The story of superpowers is a story of cycles of rise, dominance, and eventual decline. The Cold War may have ended with America on top, but the question remains: how long can any nation hold the crown in a world that never stops changing? And as the 21st century unfolds, one thing is certain: every empire, no matter how mighty, must eventually face the test of time. The next chapter is already being written, and the world is watching to see who will rise, who will fall, and what secrets the future still holds.